Welcome, everyone. I'm Vanessa Southern, the senior minister of this congregation, and I'm joined by the Reverend Margot Campbell Gross, Minister Emerita. And it is our honor, on behalf of Robert's wife, Reiko, and daughters, Nisa and Mari and Lindsay, and all of his family, to welcome you to this service in honor of the life of Robert Kingsbury Lane. As long as Reiko has been a member of this community, a part of this community, Robert has been a part also, and a bigger part than he might have known. He established deep connections with people over the years, so much so that as the ripples of the news spread out, and particularly the Wednesday after he died, our staff meeting was the most sedate and heavy it has ever been, and we have suffered a lot of loss, especially recently. The only way I can describe it is that it seemed that Robert was, for those who knew him, a force they had come to expect would be there, solid and loving and warm and intelligent and reassuring, in all the ways that make the world seem more livable. And so his loss felt so difficult for those who knew him. I can only imagine then, we can only imagine how much harder his loss must be for all of his family. All of you. And so we gather here together to mourn his life and to celebrate it also. We will gather for a reception after the service, so I hope you can stay and join. We open with words from the Vietnamese Buddhist Thich Nhat Hanh, whose writings Robert loved and who also passed away just this January. The teacher writes, "Water flows from high in the mountains, water runs deep in the earth. Miraculously, water comes to us and sustains all life. Water and sun green these plants. When the rain of compassion falls, even a desert becomes immense, a green ocean." In the spirit of those lives whose compassion greens the desert places, in the spirit of the life of Robert Kingsbury Lane, we will light our chalice this morning.
This is a richer universe than any of us dream. Through countless eons, the stars have rolled on in beautiful and undiminished speed, lighting we know not what other worlds. Here on Earth, the seasons have revolved for centuries, and Earth too has known her ice ages. Yet seeds have not failed. Life has survived, richer for all that is past. And winter yields to spring with her priceless wealth of herb and flower. Loveliest of Earth's flowers is the undying spirit of humanity. It may be that beyond the seen there lies a still vaster, unseen world. Before the sublime mystery of life and spirit, the mystery of infinite space, of endless time, this universe of light and stars and mind, we must stand in reverent awe. This much we know. We are at least one phase of the immortality of life. Like flowers on the river's edge, we bud and bloom, unfold our season of usefulness and beauty, and scatter our treasures to the wind, bequeath the promise to the future. Meanwhile, the mighty stream of life flows on to infinite new beginnings, rich and increasing, of beauty and joy and love. And in this mighty stream, we too flow on, not lost, but eternally significant. The path of life leads from our dawning until the setting of the sun, and each of us must walk that path, bring what it will, until it ends. Some will walk narrowly, fearfully, and selfishly. But there are others who give of themselves fully, carrying with them a dedication to integrity, individual excellence, and beauty. Such a soul was Bob. So much so that even as we gather to remember him, we are powered first and foremost by the spirit of Bob's life, the spirit of freedom, the spirit of adventure, the spirit of love. It is love's tribute we come to offer here today.
Born before heaven and earth, there was something undefined and yet complete in itself, silent and boundless, standing alone without change, and yet pervading all without fail. It may be thought of as the mother of all things. Though there can be no name for it, I have called it the way of life. Perhaps I should have called it the fullness of life, as fullness implies widening into space and implies still further widening until the circle is whole. In this sense, the way of life is fulfilled. Heaven is fulfilled, earth fulfilled, and humanity also fulfilled. These are the four amplitudes of the universe. Man rounding the way of earth, earth rounding the way of heaven, and heaven rounding the way of life, until the circle is full.
Robert Kingsbury Lane was born on September 1st, 1944, the first son of Jack and Trudy Lane in Los Angeles, an older brother to Christopher. Robert was a third-generation Californian raised in Pacific Palisades and received his high school diploma from the Harvard School, a private boys' school in Los Angeles. A lifelong learner, Robert went on to the University of California at Berkeley, where he pursued many academic passions, including architecture and photography, but from which he graduated with a degree in history focused on Russian history, and at the time of graduating, considering being a military attaché in Kiev. At Berkeley, Robert made many of his enduring friendships as a member of the Psi Upsilon fraternity, and upon graduation, what he chose to do was to return to Los Angeles to study law at Loyola School of Law, earning his Juris Doctor. After graduating from law school and before starting his legal career, Robert was called to serve in the U.S. Army. He had gone through Cal on the ROTC program, and this was the service he had committed to. Robert would serve as a first lieutenant and was stationed in Baltimore, Maryland. It was a time of social and political upheaval, and he was against the war in Vietnam, but served faithfully until it looked like his service might entail active combat, and the moral implications of that became real. And so Robert applied for and received, not without some roadblocks, his conscientious objector status. It was, however, during his time in Baltimore on April 14th, 1970, to be exact, that while off one day, Robert walked by the Peabody Institute in the Mount Vernon neighborhood. He was taken both by the gorgeous architecture and also by the most extraordinary music coming out of the windows. So he let himself into the building and wandered around until he found a floor of private practice rooms. And at an out-of-the-way room, he heard someone playing the most extraordinary pipe organ piece. And so Bob came in and sat down, completely uninvited, and remained there for the 3 hours that the musician practiced that day. The next week, at the same time, Robert returned, letting himself in again to this practice room and quietly taking his seat to listen again 2 hours as the musician practiced. The musician, of course, was Reiko Oda. The third week, Robert introduced himself as Bob from California. Reiko's first question was, "Are you a hippie?" He said he was not. And so the friendship began. The courtship began. The fourth week, he brought a poem he had written in his characteristic, beautiful handwriting. While she would play, it turns out he would write poetry. Then a week or so later, Robert told Reiko, "You practice too much," and insisted that they go out for ice cream, and the rest is Reiko and Bob history. They would marry. Robert's mother would plan the wedding. Robert's father would walk the bride down the aisle. And Robert would ask Reiko to play the prelude at her own wedding. And so the formal beginning of their life together as a couple commenced. Robert was released from the Army finally, and the couple moved to California, to the Bay Area, but only after Robert did research and found out that there was a fitting organ and it was available for Reiko to practice on. Neither he nor she would let Reiko's music and her gift be sidelined. In fact, as many of you, I'm sure, no doubt know, when they bought the house in Piedmont where they would raise their family, Robert made sure there was a room, one he designed and had built, with 15-foot ceilings to accommodate the pipes and organ that Reiko needed to practice, and never complained when she did just that. Reiko and Robert would have 3 children. Their marriage would last 50 years. Robert would be a great father and an adoring, supportive husband, and he would build a thriving legal practice. Fiercely principled, staunchly free-thinking, and endlessly engaged, Robert was a vigorous advocate for his clients, friends, and loved ones, and a global citizen. Over the many decades that he practiced law under his own banner, our Kingsbury Lane Incorporated, he was never known to market his services. Referrals and long-term contacts made up his loyal client list. His focus was largely business and real estate transactions and litigation, but he always, since his time at Berkeley, was a supporter of the environmental movement. And he always kept an active interest in the world, in things like how justice was or was not being served in the larger scope of national politics, for instance. As recently as November of 2021, he was writing quite pointed letters, including one I'll read from in a moment, to the Office of Legal Counsel of the United States Department of Justice in Washington. The excerpt goes, regarding, complaint, Merrick Garland's lack of spine. Dear Mr. Schroeder, Robert introduces himself and his qualifications. I follow politics somewhat closely, and I'm extremely concerned that your boss, Merrick Garland, may not have the spine to do what he needs to do to save this democracy. I think he would have made a better Supreme Court justice. Mr. Garland needs to take a deep breath and charge Steve Bannon and anyone else not complying with a congressional subpoena. The department needs to act quickly in each and every instance and not put its thumb up its bleep to see which way the wind is blowing. Please give the Department of Justice back its name and reputation for standing up for justice, not playing political wait-and-see games. The letter goes on. As dad to Nisa, Mari, and Lindsay, Robert was a coach, a tutor, a musical troupe manager, camp leader, 4th of July fireworks scofflaw, party favor distributor, constant champion and lifelong trusted advisor on things great and small. He never missed a concert or performance, changing court dates if he needed to in order to be there. Perhaps above all, Robert instilled in his daughters the importance of independent thinking, of self-reliance, and fighting for what you believe in. He modeled these values himself in the ways we heard earlier, in the ways many of you know, but also as a constant, vocal, action-oriented proponent of social and environmental justice. Robert had another side to him too, the artistic side. He viewed the world through the lens of an artist. His poetry, that poetry he wrote in the practice room in Mount Vernon and was writing throughout his life, it captured the motion and the essence of its subjects. His camera seized the candid, the wild, the unexpected, the golden moments. His sketches were never constrained by what was, only by what could be. Earlier this year, our congregation lost another beautiful spirit and human being, a woman who was also a lawyer who fought for social change. When she passed away, Robert wrote a poem for her father, knowing, I'm sure, as a father, just what an unspeakable loss Gordon was enduring. The poem was titled Elegy for a Lovely Lily. And when Robert passed away, Gordon sent his condolence note and a copy of the poem to Reiko. Written November 21st of 2021, it reads, when death comes too soon, it upsets the continuity of what we thought, assumed, presumed our lives were supposed to look like. That snapshot of the future, we settled in the present. But rather, or perhaps at this point, we've already begun our collection of lovely, smooth, but heavy, multifaceted stones to forever carry in our hearts. Robert Kingsbury Lane was on vacation with his family in Santa Cruz, pockets filled with beach treasures, his grandchildren, his wife, his children close at hand, alive to the beauty of the ocean and the sky and the sea when he suffered a life-ending heart attack. And with that loss, a multifaceted and heavy stone was added to what Reiko and Nisa and Mari and Lindsay and so many others of his beloved family and friends have added to the collection of such stones that we carry in our hearts. Robert's daughters wrote of their father's life and their loss. In our overwhelming grief at losing him, we try to see his life as he would, beautifully and uncommonly well lived. So may it be for us all.
Hello, I'm Dick Beers, and I feel very blessed to have been a close friend of Bob for almost 60 years. It is so difficult to characterize that wonderful man, Robert Kingsbury Lane. He was singularly unique. I was so fortunate to meet him as a freshman at Berkeley in the fall of 1963. When you combine the special chemistry of Bob and the energy of Berkeley, you can only expect spontaneous combustion, and that's what you got. The free speech movement, the Vietnam War, the civil rights movement, sit-ins, and through it all, we heard Bob's incredible laugh, and boy, did we need that. Just think, Bob graduated what was then a military academy in Southern California before enrolling at Cal, where he enlisted in the Army ROTC. That gave him the responsibility to wear an Army uniform on the Berkeley campus once a week during his undergraduate years. That, of course, led to lots of fascinating debates, and Bob certainly welcomed them. He was also a reader who thought deeply about issues and could express himself so effectively. In fact, he's the only person I ever knew who could successfully proclaim himself a conscientious objector while he was in the Army. To me, the evolution of his thinking on Vietnam and other issues reflects Bob's intellectual integrity. It perfectly illustrates an admonition from Mahatma Gandhi. It's not my aim to be consistent to what I have said, but to be consistent to the truth as it reveals itself to me. Bob also continuously provided us pithy observations at all times. During one spring break, we took a 1,000-mile train trip from our border to Mazatlan in Mexico. I believe it cost us $10. After 2 nights of little sleep, we sat upright in our seats. Bob would calmly proclaim, "I like Mexico," followed by 30 minutes of silence, and then, "I'd like to be a Rolling Stone." Bob was always willing to challenge institutions, and this has been reflected in his dogged determination to address issues as climate change. I've always appreciated Bob's ability to discuss these things in the context of the sometimes manic absurdity of our lives as we try to remain sane during these difficult times. When Carolyn and I lived in New York City, there was never a time when a visit from Bob didn't lead to what I would call unusual experiences. One of these events was when Carolyn and I returned to our apartment in Manhattan, and Bob had rearranged everything in the apartment. Everything was changed. But to be honest, I have to say, it actually looked better after Bob's magic touch. I'll never forget how things really changed after he met Reiko, who was so exceptional in every single way. We'll never forget a visit to Connecticut, enhanced by their car, the Shield. Even his cars had personalities. We've all marveled at Reiko's skills on the organ. Let's don't forget that Bob could pound the keyboard as well. My only issue was that it always seemed to me the same number. Nevertheless, I loved it. I can't conclude without noting how much Bob cared about his friends. When some of his fraternity brothers fell on tough times, Bob always went the extra mile to try and provide truly meaningful support. Not long ago, I reached out to Bob to get his legal perspective on a tax issue. I told him I planned to utilize the perspective of a New York ad agency in arguing my case, the truth well told. Bob responded, "I find that sometimes it's better to stand firm on another principle. The truth is not available today." In closing, I want to share an observation which I read this very morning, and I found it very comforting. Grief is the price we pay for love. My feelings for Bob can be summarized in a single word: unforgettable.
I am not Steve Banker. Steve Banker couldn't be here today, and last night Reiko asked me to say a few words. My name is Steve Pizer. First, I'm going to read the words that Steve Banker, who is ill, said. And then I would like to share with you a few words, a few memories I have of Robert. I am still in disbelief and saddened by Bob's sudden passing. I met Bob in 1983 when I, a young real estate broker, listed a property by R.M. Lane, optometrist, no relationship to Bob. Dr. Lane was well known for his hidden bifocal ads on KTVU. I was on the second floor of the building and opened what I thought was a fire exit when I walked into Bob's office in the adjoining building. I was unaware there was an easement between the two owners of the properties. From that awkward first moment, that awkward first encounter, grew a friendship and professional relationship. Bob was my friend, mentor, attorney, and client. Although Bob was very good at many facets of the law, I feel he was best in negotiating settlement in complex litigation. He had a brilliant mind, and I always felt in those negotiations Bob was playing chess with opposing counsel. Well stated. I have a nerdy hobby, a passion for trains. Yes, I am a foamer. Bob would regularly send me everything from postcards with trains on them to 3x4 frame pictures of the 20th Century Limited. In getting ready for Easter brunch at our house a few weeks ago, my wife found a small pewter steam engine in the silverware drawer. Yes, another one of Bob's thoughtful gifts reemerged. Nisa, Nare, Lindsay, Bob adored you all and was very proud of you. Whenever I mentioned one of my kids' athletic or academic endeavors, they were outdone by Bob's enthusiastic description of your professional, educational, creative, and artistic talents and accomplishments. Reiko, Bob thought the world of you and was very proud of your musical achievement. Bob is and will be missed. I still cannot believe he is gone and keep thinking I may still get that early morning phone call. And I know Steve would love to have been here today, and these are hard times. Last night I got home from somewhere, I don't remember where, not because I was drunk, but just I'm getting old. And I looked in my email, well, my wife was in the other room because I'm not allowed to look at my email late at night. And I saw a note from Rico saying that Steve Banker was ill and asked if I could say a few words. I clicked back right away and said, of course. Then I started to figure out, what am I going to say? I was wondering, what could I really say? I knew Robert for many, many years. First, I think we had a case against each other. I'm a lawyer. And second, sometimes he would send clients to me, and sometimes he'd call and we'd chat about issues. And I remember one thing when I first met him is that I would talk about his middle name, which was Kingsbury. And I grew up in the North Valley, northern part of Los Angeles, which was the poor part, and Robert grew up in the rich part. But right near to where I lived, there was a street called Kingsbury. And so I never got a straight answer as to whether or not it was named after his family or not. But he kind of let on that it was, but maybe it wasn't. I see somebody nodding. you know, our relationship changed a few years ago in 2020 when he got involved in a transaction that required him to need a lawyer. And, you know, when you go to a lawyer, the filters that you normally have when you deal with people have to be eliminated, because you have to make sure that the lawyer knows everything, including the good and the bad. There can be no surprises. Everything has to hang out. And clients sometimes don't want to tell you the bad facts, but because there's a lawyer-client privilege, they can do so with impunity and know that it's not going to be discussed until you're dead. Because the law says the privilege ends when you're dead. So I can talk a little bit more freely about things. There was nothing really grave to disclose, but our relationship was kind of tense at times. He didn't like the way that I wrote things, and I would ignore his criticisms. But what struck me most about Robert was his integrity. And integrity shows many facets. Sometimes it's the political stuff, the letters that Reverend Southern was referring to. I got those too. And his poems, his political poems. But one thing is that Robert was one of the most straightforward people as a client that I've ever met in 47 years of law practice. I'm not going to bore you with the details of the case. It went through a full trial. In a short summary, Robert and his partners went into a transaction where they were selling some property. And when you sell property in California, you're supposed to make disclosures, and there's like a list of things you have to disclose. The list is like Reader's Digest, and Robert wrote the Tale of Two Cities list of disclosures. There was everything in there. There was a loose nail on the second floor. There was this going on and that going on. This is disclosures by somebody who wants to proverbially tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth. And then there was a buyer who I will characterize as a narcissistic, arrogant developer. And just in case you guys are thinking it was not one of our former presidents, and he tried to use COVID to whittle down the price. He said Robert committed fraud by not disclosing material facts. And Robert and his partners declined to be bullied to their credit, and it's also kind of a strong thing to do because cost is always an issue. And in investigating the case, I learned that Robert's disclosures, in each of them, they were simply stated, were complete and accurate, and they carried the day. And the judge who decided the case in finding for Robert and his partners agreed. He put it this way, and I'm quoting: "This was a case about allegations the sellers had failed to disclose material information in the formation of the final contract." And that's what it was about. And the judge went on to say that the buyer claimed the seller defrauded him by telling him the truth. And I read that and I said, wow, that's why he's a judge and I'm not. So Robert Kingsbury Lane was a man of impeccable integrity and principle. He's a man I'll never forget, who will have a lasting impression on me. And I suspect on many of you here today. Those are my prepared statements. There are two things I want to add. One, Steve Banker talked about the early morning phone calls. And I got to tell you, while this case was going on, every morning as I was driving to work, I would do 510-508-1944. And Robert and I would talk. I wouldn't charge for that. We'd just talk. And I'd say, sometimes I'd talk to him as a client, sometimes I'd say, you're the lawyer next door, what do you think? And the other thing that struck me was that Vladimir Putin waited until Robert Lane was gone before he invaded the Ukraine. Thank you.
It never works when you're ready for it. So much for prepared statements. I'm not a lawyer. Robert was my very dear friend for about 50 years, from when he moved back from the East Coast. And we had many adventures together. And I want to tell a couple of anecdotes that are not at his expense, but I think whenever I think of these experiences, I think of Robert. And Lindsay, you're going to have to forgive me for this. But when we both sort of separated for a number of years and were raising our little children, and then finally he and Reiko and Mari and Lindsay came up to Kingston, Washington, where I live, and we got reacquainted. And we're sitting at dinner one night, and I, as most parents, said to the children, I said, if you don't finish your dinner, you don't get dessert. Do you remember this? Lindsay stood up and she said, oh no, the box is empty. And she pointed right here to her stomach. She said, the dessert box is always empty. And that was the character of being with the Lane family. And I loved it, and I was the richer for it. Many years later, Robert and I were at a photographic rendezvous down in Carmel, and he was an insatiable photographer, as you probably know. And Al Weber, who was running the event, was taking ahead, a few years before, he'd been taking out a group of photography students to take pictures down at Moss Landing. And Imogen Cunningham was sort of sitting there, and a friend of all of theirs. And she thought she'd go along for the ride. And they go down to the pier. And Al stops everybody at the beginning. He says, now, please, when you go by this first cannery, just go on by, don't take any pictures. The guy there is, the manager is very unfriendly. It's kind of an ogre. So they walked on, and then Al turned around and saw Imogen standing there. And I don't know if you know what Imogen looked like. Reiko is statuesque compared to Imogen. She was a tiny little lady. He looked back, and there's Reiko in the middle of the street, and this big, heavy manager is poking her in the chest. And Al couldn't hear a thing that was going on. But all of a sudden, she's poking him in the chest. And she backed him up until he sat down on the steps of his cannery so she could take his portrait. And Bob and I thought, it's a wonderful story. I always thought that's exactly what Bob would have done in that moment. Because as a photographer, he couldn't resist anything that caught his imagination, caught his eye, whether it was something that was out of place or something that was absolutely perfect. And he took tens of thousands of pictures. And I think most of you have probably only seen one or two. I know I've only seen maybe two. I was at his house a few years ago, and he asked me to work on his computer so that he might edit some of the pictures to print them. And I think he had this ambition a number of times that he might start printing his pictures, but I don't think that he ever was going to. But on his desk, he had this box. It was about this big, about 6 inches square. and I opened it up, and there must have been 100 little SD cards that go in cameras. This was all of his pictures, and he never looked at them. He took the pictures, took the card out, put it in the box, put a new card in the camera, and he had all these cameras. He had wonderful cameras. And I think that he had no ambitions to be an artist as a photographer, maybe as a musician. And I did hear that tune a few times that you were talking about. I think that he was in part an anthropologist, part a journalist, a photojournalist. I think that he celebrated the moment, and that's what the photographs were all about. And I want to close in saying that he was immensely proud of his daughters. And I think of him all the time, and I can still hear his cry of joie de vivre.
It's a whole different perspective from up here.
Let me give you a little more height there.
My name is John Hogle, and I am Bob's cousin, 1 year older. As has been previously mentioned, this building holds a significant place in Bob's life. Reiko has played here for, what, 20 years? Or more than 20 years on that beautiful organ upstairs. Nisa and Martine were married on this very stage or altar. So this is a wonderful place in their family history. I know, as everybody has mentioned prior, that Bob had a wide variety of talents and interests, most of which were available for everybody to see, but not all of them. I'd like to sort of paint a picture of the man that I knew. Both of our families grew up in Southern California. We were close enough that we got together as families on a regular basis, the normal holidays, birthdays, and so on. But we were always in Bob's house, never in our house. And that was his dad. His dad wanted to be a host and not a guest. And his dad sort of ruled the environment, shall we say, when people were there. His father was a very successful, quintessential entrepreneur. He'd start a company, grow it, sell it, and start all over again. This allowed his mother, who had tremendous style and appreciation of the arts, to redecorate their home. They'd buy a house, she'd redecorate it, and then sell it, and then buy another one. These weren't rundown places. These were West LA, Pacific Palisades, and if you know the area, it's quite wealthy. But that was the way it went. And this was Bob's foundation in life. He was surrounded by success of his father. He was independent. He appreciated the arts, and he developed a real estate at this very young age he developed an interest in real estate at this very young age. The families, we drifted apart. Father's careers took different directions into different parts of the world. We reconnected, Bob and I, at Berkeley in the 60s. And it was mentioned here that when he wore his ROTC uniform on campus, I imagine, I was never privy to this, but I imagined his conversations and his debates were cataclysmic, shall we say. This was a time when the National Guard was on campus, helicopters were gassing Sproul Plaza, but Bob endured that. He was studying, as mentioned earlier, a variety of subjects, especially Russian history, literature, and then philosophy. 4 of us, Bob, 2 of his fraternity brothers, and myself, lived for our senior year in a flat on College Avenue. And this is where I really began to appreciate Bob's intellect. He never studied, never. And he hadn't done a lick of work until the night before some major paper was due. He'd sit down, and in 3 hours would dash off 20 pages and get an A. It drove me crazy, because I'm a grunt. I have to sit down and study all the time. The one thing that stood out in that episode, that period of time for me, was the 4 of us decided that in this flat, we needed a rooftop deck. Now, you're talking about 20-year-olds who are majoring in communication, music, poli-sci, and Russian history. What do we know about construction? But we figured a couple of 2x4s and some plywood, we could build a deck on the roof. And sure enough, we did. I'm sure the landlord really appreciated the nail holes in his roof. But Bob said, and this is typical, it improved the value of the property and made it infinitely more rentable. And there again, real estate comes into play. We drifted apart again as Bob went to law school down in LA. After law school, as was mentioned previously, the Army thought they could use Bob back in the DC area. After a while, Bob had other ideas, but I suspect that the Army did him the greatest favor of his life. Because on one day, he was in Baltimore, and he went to the Peabody School of Music. He followed the sounds of a grand organ drifting through the hallways. He peeked in one of the practice rooms, and there he saw a diminutive young woman playing with her long hair swishing back and forth as she played on the double rank. Bob was mesmerized. He went back again and again and again. He said it was just the music. I think it was a lot more than just the music. They returned, Bob and Rako, to the Bay Area, moved into a house in Rockridge in Oakland. I lived there with them for a year as Bob started his law career as a sole practitioner. It was a rocky beginning for him. As was mentioned, he relied solely on referrals and personal contacts. But that over time, that client list developed into a solid practice that specialized in real estate law. The other thing I learned during this time was that Rako is a fabulous cook. And she makes absolutely the best Mexican food in the world. The two of them, of course, started their family, and they have three most delightful and most accomplished daughters. I know that Bob must have been filled with pride as he listened to the Lane family quartet when they were younger. We drifted again when I moved to Seattle. We stayed in touch and would visit whenever I came down to the Bay Area. You notice he never went up there, but I came down. It was years before Bob invited me to visit his home and his office in Point Richmond. It was an overwhelming experience. Bob's appreciation of the fine arts had exploded into an extensive collection of Oriental, primarily Japanese, bronzes, woodblock prints, augmented by paintings that had hung in his childhood homes, photography, carpets, and books everywhere. I suppose that I contributed a little bit to this chaos. We both acted as art pickers for each other, sending each other items that we thought the other would enjoy. Big, small, didn't matter. Just the week before Bob's passing, I sent him a stamp, one simple stamp from Liechtenstein that depicted one of his earliest lithographs that he ever purchased. I thought he'd get a kick out of it, that his taste was now being validated by a country. I hope that the post office managed to deliver it in time. His office and his home may have looked like chaos, but I am sure that Bob knew exactly where every case file was. And if he didn't, he had somebody at his side who had been with him for many, many years, and I am sure that she did. As many of you know, it's always those in the quote-unquote back room that keep an organization running smoothly. I've tried to give you a complete picture of Bob, but I know I haven't been successful. He was a successful attorney who had a wonderful way with words, a family man, a collector of fine things, a musician, coming from his father. But like was mentioned, he played one tune. It was a ragtime, boogie-woogie kind of thing, which is what his father had played. And he was had a boisterous joie de vivre that you couldn't forget. He'll be profoundly missed, by his immediate and extended family and his colleagues in the legal profession. I know that he hoped to leave the legal profession in a better place than when he started his practice. It is a hope that we all have, that each of us makes the world a little better, that we have made a difference, no matter how infinitely small. Rest in peace, Bob, knowing that you have made all of our lives a little bit better. I have also been asked to read two other messages, one from his brother, Christopher, who is in Dallas and unable to be with us today, and the other from my sister, Bob's remaining cousin, who lives in Kentucky. God knows why, but also cannot be with us. First, from his brother, Christopher. Growing up in the Lane household was not the simple task you might have thought it was. Like any task in the 50s and any household in the 50s and 60s, there were rules and chores. But this was the Lane household, and quote unquote, we do not follow other households. We are not the Smith family, nor the Joneses, was the mantra. We are the Lane household. Chris was 5 years younger than Bob. I was still in my single-digit years when Bob became a teenager, and remember vividly listening to the glorious sounds of the car radio. The Everly Brothers, Elvis, Little Richard. These were sounds that no other 8-year-old would be privy to unless he had an older brother who opened the door to another world waiting to be discovered. Bob's first car with a radio was a Chevy Nova. He also would occasionally borrow his mother's Chrysler station wagon to drive to school at the Harvard School. This station wagon had a monster engine in it, and it was a flying tank. As if you remember the cars of the 50s and 60s, they were built like tanks. Bob, one fateful day, was driving the Chrysler to school in the rain. Wow, the discussions that followed all centered on one thing, maybe two. The first was Bob. The second was how much it was going to cost to pay for the Beverly Hills light post. I didn't realize how much light posts cost 60 years ago. Certainly the ones in Beverly Hills must have been gold-plated. I'd be remiss also if I didn't mention the escape from reality called Malibu Lake. In 1956, it snowed at the lower elevations around Los Angeles, and Mom decided to take us to see the snow. We drove well north of LA, probably on Mulholland Drive, where we got lost. There was no GPS in those days. Taking one of the roads off of Mulholland, we discovered a lake out in the middle of nowhere. We finally found our way home, and Mom talked about the lake so much that the next weekend, the whole family drove to the lake and spoke with the lake manager. Mom and Dad looked at many houses, And then eventually we're told that there was one last house, but it was so run down, you wouldn't be interested in it. Well, I think they bought it on the spot. It was run down, but it was the best piece of property on the entire lake. The old saw, location, location, location. Starting growing up, spending their summers at the lake, they developed a close-knit, Bob developed a close-knit group of friends. We're going to wrap it up quick. Anyway, there was an incident with the toilet and a cherry bomb, which you've all heard stories about, I'm sure, in your days. One last thing from Chris is that 2 days after Bob passed, he woke up about 2 in the morning with a song beating through his head. It was a song from the late 60s, 1970s. He hadn't thought about it in years, and it had a stellar group of musicians playing the song, and the song was entitled, "That's the Way God Planned It." And it was special to Chris because Bob had given him that album back in 1970 to Chris for Christmas. Bob will be terribly missed by many, with a huge hole created in my life that will never be filled, reminiscing, advice, debating past and current political debacles, real and imagined, and how to fix everything that's wrong. I have another long letter from my sister.
We can invite people to
And I
share it
think,
later.
yes.
I'll make copies for people.
Okay, thank you. I'm getting hoarse anyway. Thank you.
This is the King James Version of Psalm 23. The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. He maketh me to lie down in green pastures. He leadeth me beside the still waters. He restoreth my soul. He leadeth me in the paths of righteousness for his name's sake. Yea, though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil, for thou art with me. Thy rod and thy staff, they comfort me. Thou preparest a table before me in the presence of mine enemies. Thou anointest my head with oil, my cup runneth over. Surely goodness and mercy shall follow me all the days of my life, and I will dwell in the house of the Lord forever.
I'd invite us to rise in body or spirit and sing hymn number 318 in the gray hymnals in front of you, We Would Be One, accompanied by a gifted organist in the organ loft. Let's sing together.
Please be seated. We are gathered here together to bid a final farewell to Bob. We stand today in the presence of unfathomable mystery. With humble hearts, we bow before the veil which has fallen between us and the one we loved. Let none fear, for greater than sorrow is love, which endureth through pain and conquereth even grief. Love binds all hearts in bonds of fellowship and courage. They who love unselfishly face even the depth with courage, for their strength is the strength of many, and their courage rests upon the love of friends. As it is written by the psalmist, I will lift mine eyes unto the hills, from whence cometh my strength. My help comes from the heavens and the earth, from good neighbors and the spirit of the hills and the valley, which I cannot make my own. My help comes from outside and from inside, It waits when I am impatient. It goads me when I hesitate from fear. When I am strong with courage and with faith, the sun and rain shall not smite me by day, and sorrow will not haunt me by night. Goodness and mercy will follow me all the days of my life. I will lift mine eyes unto the hills. They will keep my coming in and my going out. They look from afar like the inscrutable heights of the soul. And now, to Bob, we say farewell. He goes free of the earth. The sun of his last day sets clear in the sweetness of his liberty. The earth recovers from his dying, the hallow of his life remaining in all his death leaves. Radiance knows him. Grown lighter than breath, he is set free in our remembering. Grown brighter than vision, he goes dark into the life of the hill that holds his peace. He's hidden among all that is and cannot be lost. In this spirit, then, the spirit of everlasting love, we commit thee, Bob, to thy rest. The world is better for your having lived. We are better for having loved you. We loved you living. We love you now. Rest in peace and in the love we bear you. Farewell. And now, in our going, may God bless and keep us. May the face of God shine upon us and out from within us, and be gracious unto us, and bring us peace this day and forevermore. Amen. Please remain seated for the postlude.